The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds of my bedroom, spilling warm streaks of gold across the hardwood floor and over my bare arms. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, the light catching the edges of my reflection, softening the lines of a body I'd worked hard to keep strong. Years of hiking up rugged trails and stretching into Pilates poses had left me with a trim waist, arms that could carry a pack without complaint, and legs that held the quiet power of countless mornings spent chasing the sunrise. My skin, tanned from hours outdoors, glowed faintly under the sun's touch, and the faint imprint of a tank top strap marked my shoulder, a badge of my active days. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, the chestnut strands falling loose around my face. Tonight was a big deal, my first date in years, and the chaos on my bed mocked me for it. Dresses lay strewn across the quilt like a battlefield of choices. Silk, cotton, lace, each one a question I couldn't answer. A tight emerald number sat crumpled on one side, its bold sheen tempting but unfamiliar. Next to it, a loose gray dress hung limp, soft but uninspired, like it didn't know what it wanted to be. A navy skirt and blouse combo, crisp, tailored, peeked out from the pile, but it felt too stiff, too much like the old me who'd stopped living for a while. I'd been out of the game since my husband passed, and stepping back into it felt like walking blind into a storm. I wasn't worried about my looks. I knew I'd kept myself up. But picking the right outfit? That was a war I wasn't sure I could win. I reached for the emerald dress first, sliding it over my head. The fabric hugged my curves, clinging to the dip of my waist and the swell of my hips in a way that made me stand a little taller. It was daring, the kind of thing that screamed confidence I hadn't felt in ages. But staring at myself in the mirror, the woman looking back felt like a stranger, too bold, too soon. I peeled it off, letting it drop back onto the bed, and grabbed the gray one instead. It flowed over me, forgiving and light. But when I turned to check the fit, it just hung there, dull against my skin. No spark, no fire. I tossed it aside, frustration creeping up my spine, and tried the navy skirt next, pairing it with the blouse. The outfit traced the lines of my legs, hinting at their strength without shouting, but it was too safe, too buttoned up for a night like this. I unbuttoned the blouse and let it fall, my breath catching as I surveyed the mess again. Nothing fit the woman I wanted to be tonight, not the widow, not the hiker, but someone alive, someone who could still turn a head or two. The clock on my nightstand ticked louder, a reminder that time wasn't on my side. I needed help, someone to cut through the noise in my head. "Lucas, you around?" I called out, my voice wavering but loud enough to carry through the apartment. It felt strange asking, but he'd been my anchor lately, more than just the stepson I'd inherited when I married his dad. Footsteps echoed down the hall, steady and sure, and then there he was, filling the doorway with his broad frame. Lucas, 28 now, had his father's height and shoulders, but his hazel eyes and easy calm were all his own. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed loosely over his chest, a faint grin tugging at his lips as he took in the disaster of my room. "Need a hand?" he asked, his deep voice rolling out smooth and even, like he already knew the answer. I gestured to the bed, my cheeks warming as I admitted, "I'm lost here. It's been too long since I've done this, and I don't want to mess it up." My hands dropped to my sides, and I caught his gaze in the mirror, steady, reassuring, like he could see right through the tangle of nerves I was hiding. Lucas had been around since my husband's death 3 years back, stepping in when I didn't know I needed him. He wasn't just family anymore. He was the guy who'd sit with me over coffee, listen to my rants about work, or haul firewood when the power went out. And now, here he was, smirking at my pile of dresses like it was no big deal. "Looks like a war zone," he said, stepping closer, his boots scuffing lightly against the floor. "What's the plan, knock this guy out or play it safe?" His tone was teasing, but his eyes held mine, waiting for me to lead the way. I laughed, a short, nervous sound, and shrugged. "I just want to feel like me again, you know? Not overdo it, but not fade into the background either." He nodded, slow and thoughtful, like he got it, really got it. "All right," he said, scanning the bed. "Let's figure it out." And just like that, the weight on my chest lightened, if only a little. Lucas was here, and somehow that made the storm feel less wild. Lucas stepped into the room, his presence shrinking the space around me as he moved toward the bed. The late afternoon light caught the edges of his jaw, sharp and shadowed, and I couldn't help but notice the way his flannel shirt stretched across his shoulders. He picked up the emerald dress I'd tried earlier, holding it up by the straps like he was inspecting a map. "Not this," he said, his voice firm, and tossed it back onto the pile with a flick of his wrist. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms over my chest. "Since when are you a fashion expert?" I teased, but there was an edge to it. I wanted to know what he saw that I didn't. He smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting, as he reached for a slinky maroon slip dress buried under the gray one. "I know what works," he said, holding it up to the light. The fabric shimmered, deep and rich, but he shook his head. "Too loud." His hazel eyes flicked to mine, sharp and appraising, like he was reading more than just the clothes. I huffed, half amused, half annoyed, and gestured to the mess. "Fine, you pick then. I'm out of ideas." He didn't answer right away, just sifted through the pile with a calm focus that made my stomach twist. I retreated to the bathroom, grabbing a cream silk blouse and a fitted skirt on the way. The door clicked shut behind me, and I slipped the blouse over my shoulders, the cool fabric brushing my skin as I buttoned it up. It was sleek, tracing the lines of my torso without clinging too tight, and the skirt hugged my hips, showing off the legs I'd earned from years on the trails. I smoothed it down, checking the mirror. It wasn't bold, but it had a quiet strength, maybe too quiet. I stepped out, bare feet padding against the hardwood, and caught Lucas leaning against the dresser, arms still crossed. His gaze swept over me, lingering on the way the skirt framed my thighs, and for a second, I felt the air shift. "Too safe," he said, his voice low, almost a rumble. I frowned, hands resting on my hips. "What's wrong with safe?" I shot back, but my pulse ticked up under his stare. He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "You're better than that, Grace." The words landed heavier than they should have, and I couldn't tell if it was the tone or the way his eyes didn't waver. I opened my mouth to argue, but he was already moving, picking up a soft silver slip dress from the edge of the bed. The fabric gleamed faintly, thin straps dangling from his fingers as he held it out. "Try this," he said, his voice steady but quieter now, like he was daring me to trust him. I hesitated, our fingers brushing as I took it from him, a quick warm jolt that made me pull back faster than I meant to. "All right," I muttered, turning back to the bathroom, my heart thudding louder than it had any right to. Inside, I peeled off the blouse and skirt, letting them pool on the tile floor. The silver dress slid over my head, cool and smooth against my skin, settling into place like it belonged there. The hem skimmed just above my knees, and the neckline dipped low enough to hint without shouting. I turned to the mirror, smoothing my hands over my hips. It hugged me in all the right places, my waist, my chest, the curve of my backside. Simple but alive, like it woke something up in me. I took a breath, steadying myself, and stepped back into the bedroom. Lucas straightened as I emerged, his breath catching. Just a hitch, but I heard it. His hazel eyes darkened, tracing me from head to toe, and the room felt smaller, the air thicker. "That's the one," he said, his voice low and firm, though I saw his fingers flex at his sides, like he was holding something back. I turned to the mirror, catching my reflection. The dress made me look strong, effortless, the woman I'd forgotten I could be. "You think?" I asked, glancing at him over my shoulder. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, sliding over the way the fabric shimmered against my skin. "Yeah," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. I caught his eyes in the mirror again, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched, heavy with something I couldn't name, something that wasn't just about the dress. I looked away first, brushing my hair back, trying to shake it off. "Okay," I said, forcing a smile. "Guess you're not useless after all." He chuckled, soft and low, but his eyes stayed on me a beat too long before he stepped back toward the door. "Just don't let this guy miss it," he said, and I couldn't tell if he meant the dress or something else. The air hummed between us as I watched him go, my fingers still tingling where they'd brushed his. I stepped out of the cab, the silver slip dress catching the glow of the restaurant's marquee as I smoothed it over my hips. The night air was cool against my bare shoulders, a sharp contrast to the warmth still lingering from Lucas's look back at the apartment. Inside, the place buzzed with low chatter and the clink of glasses, candlelight flickering across white tablecloths. Nathan was already there, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room, his suit crisp and his grin too wide. I'd been seeing him casually, a few coffees, a lunch, but tonight was the real test, and I felt it in the pit of my stomach as I slid into the seat across from him. "Wow, Grace," he said, his eyes raking over me, lingering on the neckline of the dress. "You clean up nice." His voice had that salesman edge, smooth but pushy, and I forced a smile, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Thanks," I said, keeping it light, but his gaze didn't lift. It just traveled, possessive, like he was sizing up a prize. The waiter came by, and I ordered a glass of red, hoping it'd steady the unease creeping up my spine. Nathan launched in, barely pausing as the wine arrived. "Just closed a deal on a condo downtown," he said, swirling his bourbon. "Big commission. You should see the view. Beats anything around here." He grinned, waiting for me to nod, impressed. I sipped my wine, the dry bite grounding me as I murmured, "Sounds like a win." He didn't catch the flatness in my tone, just kept going. His car, his gym routine, the kind of woman he needed on his arm. "You've got the figure for my lifestyle," he said, leaning closer, his breath heavy with liquor. "I need someone who can keep up, look good doing it." I tightened my grip on the stem of my glass, the silver dress suddenly feeling like a spotlight I didn't want. "Sounds like a tall order," I said, my voice dry, a hint of a jab in it, but he just chuckled, missing it entirely. "You're halfway there, Grace," he replied, his eyes dropping to my chest again, and my skin crawled. I shifted in my seat, crossing my legs under the table, the fabric sliding against my thighs. Lucas had picked this dress to make me feel strong, not cheap, but Nathan's stare twisted it into something else. Dinner dragged on, steak for him, a salad I barely touched for me. He talked over the clatter of plates, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "I like a woman who's independent," he said, cutting into his meat, "but knows when to let me take the lead." His fork paused, and he looked at me, expectant, like I was supposed to agree. I forced another smile, my patience thinning. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out," I said, polite but sharp, and he grinned again, oblivious, reaching across to brush his fingers against mine. I pulled my hand back, resting it in my lap, my stomach churning at the thought of being molded into his checklist. By the time the waiter cleared the plates, I was done. Nathan ordered a dessert, some overpriced mousse he insisted I try, but I just pushed it around with my spoon, appetite gone. I glanced at my watch, the hands creeping past 9. "I should head home," I said, keeping my tone even but firm. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. "It's still early. Thought we'd grab a drink somewhere quieter." His hand hovered near mine again, and I shook my head, standing as I smoothed the dress down. "Early start tomorrow," I lied, flashing a tight smile. "Rain check." He frowned but didn't push, waving for the check with a flick of his wrist. Outside, his arm draped over my shoulders as we waited for the valet, and I stiffened, counting the seconds until the cab pulled up. I slid into the back seat, relief washing over me as the door shut, cutting off his "call me" through the window. The city lights streaked past, a blur of neon against the dark, and I leaned my head against the cool glass, frustration simmering under my skin. Nathan's words echoed, his lifestyle, his type, like I was a piece to fit his puzzle. The dress clung to me, a reminder of Lucas's quiet confidence in me, and all Nathan had done was tarnish it. I stared out at the hum of the streets, my mind drifting back to the apartment, to Lucas's steady voice, his hazel eyes cutting through my doubt. Nathan saw a trophy. Lucas saw me. The cab rolled on, and I let the thought settle, heavy and warm, as the distance grew between me and a night I'd rather forget. The apartment was quiet when I got back, the hum of the city muffled behind the windows as I kicked off my heels by the door. The hardwood felt cool under my feet, a small mercy after the night I'd had. My purse hit the counter with a soft thud, and I made straight for the kitchen, the silver dress swaying against my thighs. Nathan's voice still buzzed in my head, his smug grin, his hands too close, and I needed something to drown it out. The amber bottle of whiskey sat on the shelf, glinting in the dim light, and I poured a generous splash into a tumbler, the liquid swirling as I tipped it back. The burn hit my throat, sharp and welcome, spreading heat through my chest as I carried the glass to the living room. I sank into the couch, the cushions giving way under me, and let out a long breath. The TV remote lay on the coffee table, and I grabbed it, flipping through channels with restless fingers. A cooking show flickered by, then a news recap, but nothing stuck. I paused on a sappy romance. Two lovers in soft focus, whispering promises under a tree. It ached to watch, stirring up a longing I hadn't let myself feel in years, and I almost changed it. But then the screen shifted, the next film starting without warning, and I froze. It was one of those late-night movies, the kind that didn't bother with pretense. Two bodies tangled together, moving slow and deliberate, their heat spilling through the glow of the screen. My thumb hovered over the remote, but I didn't press it. The actors' hands roamed, their breaths heavy, and something tightened low in my belly, a pull I'd buried too long. I set the glass down, the whiskey forgotten, and leaned back, my eyes locked on the scene. The woman arched into him, her skin flushed, and I felt my own pulse quicken, my body waking up to a need I'd ignored since my husband died. My hands moved before I could think, tentative at first, brushing over the silver fabric still clinging to me. The dress felt alive under my fingers, and I let them drift lower, tracing the curve of my hip, the heat building as the actor's rhythm matched my own. I lost myself in it, the room fading to just me and the screen, my breaths coming soft and uneven. The tension from the night, Nathan's arrogance, the weight of starting over, melted into something raw, something mine. My fingers slipped under the hem, the cool air kissing my skin as I pushed the fabric up, baring my thighs. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation take over, my body trembling with a hunger I couldn't name. It was reckless, unguarded, and I didn't care, until a floorboard creaked. My eyes snapped open, heart slamming against my ribs as I turned. Lucas stood in the doorway, his broad frame shadowed against the hall light, his hazel eyes wide and dark. He was still, like he'd stopped mid-step, and the air thickened between us. "I didn't mean to," he started, his voice rough, low. But I cut him off, my own voice barely a whisper. "Stay." It slipped out, a dare I hadn't planned, and my cheeks burned as I held his gaze, defiant despite the shock crashing through me. He hesitated, his hands clenching at his sides, and I saw the struggle in his face. Guilt, want, something deeper. The TV glowed behind me, the actor's murmurs a faint hum, but it was his eyes that pinned me there, raw and unguarded. He took a step closer, then another, until he was at the edge of the couch. I didn't move, didn't cover myself, the silver dress bunched around my waist like a confession. His breath hitched, and I reached out, my hand trembling as it found his. Our fingers locked, the contact sending a jolt up my arm, warm and electric. "Grace," he said, my name a question, but I didn't answer with words. I stood, the dress sliding back down my legs, and then I reached for the hem again, slower this time. His eyes followed as I lifted it, the fabric whispering against my skin, until it was over my head, falling to the floor in a soft heap. I stood there, bare in the flickering light, my heart pounding as his gaze traveled over me, my shoulders, my chest, the dip of my waist. He didn't speak, but his hands flexed and I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until it was just heat and breath and the weight of what we weren't saying. I stood there, the cool air brushing my bare skin, the silver dress a crumpled shadow on the floor. Lucas's eyes were locked on mine. Hazel turned dark with something wild, and the silence between us hummed like a live wire. My hand shook as I reached for his shirt, fingers fumbling over the buttons. The flannel was rough under my touch, warm from his body, and each one I undid revealed more of him. Broad chest, the hard lines of muscle earned from years of hauling gear and fixing things around the place. His breath stuttered as I pushed the shirt off his shoulders, letting it fall beside my dress, and I felt the heat of him close enough to taste. "Grace," he murmured, my name rough on his tongue. "Are you sure?" His voice was low, husky, laced with a hesitation that made my chest ache. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes," I whispered, the word trembling but certain, and that was all it took. He stepped closer, his hands finding my waist, warm and steady, pulling me against him. His lips brushed mine, soft at first, testing, but then they pressed harder, deeper, and I melted into it. My fingers tangled in his hair, thick and dark, as the kiss turned fierce, a spark catching fire between us. We stumbled back, my calves hitting the couch, but he didn't stop. His hand slid up my back, tracing the curve of my spine with a reverence that made my breath hitch. I tugged at his belt, the metallic clink loud in the quiet room, and worked it free, my fingers brushing the denim beneath. He groaned, soft and low, his grip tightening on my hips as I pushed the jeans down, leaving him bare before me. The TV flickered in the corner, forgotten, its glow painting us in shifting light as we stood there, stripped down to nothing but skin and want. I pulled him toward the hall, our hands still clasped, and we moved through the shadows, footsteps soft against the floor. The bedroom door loomed ahead, and he paused at the threshold, his eyes searching mine one last time. I squeezed his hand, leading him inside, and he kicked the door shut behind us. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, silver and faint, washing over the bed in the center of the room. The sheets were crisp, cool, a stark contrast to the heat building between us, and I turned to face him, my heart racing so loud I swore he could hear it. He leaned in, his lips finding mine again, slow this time, like he was savoring every second. I pressed against him, my chest to his, feeling the thud of his heartbeat match mine. His hands roamed, warm and deliberate, sliding down my sides, over the flare of my hips, pulling me closer until there was no space left. I gasped as his mouth trailed to my neck, leaving a line of fire across my skin, and I arched into him, my fingers digging into his shoulders. "Lucas!" I breathed, his name a plea, and he answered with a low hum, his lips brushing the hollow just below my ear. We moved to the bed, a tangle of limbs and breath, and I sank into the sheets, pulling him down with me. His weight settled over me, solid and real, and I marveled at how he fit there, how his hands knew just where to touch. He traced the curve of my waist, slow and careful, like he was memorizing me, and I shivered under his fingers, my body alive with every graze. I ran my hands over his chest, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way they flexed as he held himself above me, and I pulled him closer, needing more. Our kisses deepened, urgent now, the hunger between us spilling over. His hands gripped my hips, steady and sure, and I arched to meet him, our bodies finding a rhythm that felt inevitable. The room was silent except for our breathing, heavy and ragged, and the faint creak of the bed beneath us. His lips found mine again, then drifted lower, brushing my collarbone, my chest, and I shuddered, my fingers twisting in his hair as he explored me. Every touch was a spark, every whisper of my name a tether, and I let myself fall into it, the world outside fading until it was just us, raw, real, and completely undone. The night stretched on, moonlight shifting across the walls, and we moved together, slow and tender, like we'd been waiting for this forever. It wasn't just heat, it was him seeing me, all of me, and me seeing him back. And in that quiet, tangled space, I felt something shift, something I couldn't take back, but didn't want to. Morning light slipped through the curtains, a soft golden haze spilling across the room, warming the air still heavy with the scent of us. I stirred, my body humming with the echoes of the night, a quiet ache in my limbs that felt both foreign and familiar. The sheets twisted around me, cool against my skin, and I blinked slowly, the haze of sleep giving way to the weight of reality. Lucas lay beside me, his chest rising and falling steady, one arm draped across my waist. His touch was light, tentative, like he wasn't sure he still belonged there, but his hazel eyes were wide open, watching me with a mix of warmth and something unsteady. Uncertainty, maybe, or fear. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched thick between us, filled with questions too big to voice, emotions too tangled to unravel. I shifted, the sheet slipping down my shoulder, and his gaze followed it, soft but intense, like he was seeing me all over again. My heart kicked up, a frantic thud against my ribs as the truth settled in. We'd crossed a line last night, one we'd danced around for years, and there was no stepping back now. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck, caught in the mess of guilt and longing swirling inside me. "Grace," he finally whispered, his voice rough from sleep, raw with something vulnerable. His hand tightened slightly on my hip, like he was afraid I'd pull away, and I turned to face him fully, my eyes searching his. His face was a map of feelings, longing in the set of his mouth, regret in the crease of his brow, and something else, something tender I couldn't quite name. It made my chest ache, sharp and sweet. I reached up, my fingers brushing his cheek, the stubble rough under my touch, and he leaned into it, eyes closing for a heartbeat like he was holding on to the feel of me. When he opened them again, there was a softness there that stole my breath. "I don't regret it," he said, quiet but firm, though his eyes flickered with doubt. "But I don't know what happens now." His words hung there, heavy, and I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I didn't regret it either, not the way he'd looked at me, not the way he'd made me feel seen, but the aftermath loomed like a shadow, impossible to ignore. We weren't just stepmother and stepson anymore. We were something else, something messy and forbidden, and it scared me as much as it pulled me in. I shifted closer, my skin brushing his, and his breath hitched, his hand sliding to rest on my hip, firm but gentle. "Lucas," I murmured, my voice low, rough with the weight of it all, and his fingers traced slow patterns on my skin, sending sparks through me even now. I closed my eyes, letting out a soft sigh as I leaned into his touch, my body still tender from the night before, every nerve alive under his hands. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine, slow and tender, and my heart raced, the kiss pulling me back into that fire we'd lit. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I pressed against him, my fingers tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened. The tension in the room thickened, the air warm with unspoken words and lingering want. His mouth trailed to my neck, soft and teasing, finding that spot just below my ear, and I gasped, my hands gripping his shoulders as a shiver ran through me. His breath was hot against my skin, his touch careful but hungry. And I felt that pull again, sharp and undeniable. My hands drifted lower, tracing the planes of his chest, the hard lines of muscle under my palms, and his breath caught, his body tensing as my fingers grew bolder. "Grace," he whispered, my name a rough plea, and I hesitated, just for a second before sliding down the bed. My lips followed, brushing kisses along his chest, his torso, tasting the salt of his skin. His hands tangled in my hair, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I moved lower, my heart pounding with the thrill of it. When I reached his hips, I paused, looking up at him, his face a mix of awe and desperation, his eyes locked on mine, and I felt the power of it, the way he trembled under me. But then the light shifted, the sun climbing higher, and I stopped, my breath shaky as I pulled back. He reached for me, his hand finding mine, and we lay there, tangled in the sheets, the silence settling around us again. "Now what?" I echoed his question, my voice barely above a whisper, and he squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing my knuckles. Neither of us had an answer, but his touch said enough. For now, we'd hold on and figure out the rest later.